All right, for this next step, I'm going to go over a few different ways I'm going to be modeling things. So I'll cover a couple different objects, just modeling them, and then I'll probably jump into a time lapse of just me doing a bunch of different detail work to the house. But first, I'll definitely explain the different ways I'm going to be modeling things. And for the most part, I'm mostly just going to be using the multi-cut tool, the extrude tool, the bevel tool, and maybe the if I can find it. It may not even be on here, but um, yeah, it's not. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. Um, so yeah, let's start by probably modeling one of the more complicated objects here, just so you can get a good idea of how I'm going to do things. So I'm going to model this little frame part right here in front of the house. And this is one of those things that as I'm looking at it, I'm seeing that the AI is a little unclear on how, again, how the logics of this stuff works. Up here, it seems like this is kind of extending out past the shingles. And then as we get a little further down, it kind of blends into the shingles. And then as we come down further, it looks like it's just kind of under the shingles, right? So it kind of changes as it progresses. So I'm going to make sort of like an executive decision here and model it as if it's sort of sticking out beyond the shingles a little bit. And just sort of solidify that decision. Again, AI isn't great at making these logic decisions or really sort of sussing out how the details of something works. So if we're using AI as a point of reference, we kind of have to make these decisions for it. So in this case, I'm just going to start out here with a cube. So I'm just going to create a cube, and I'm going to start at the very top of the house here. And we can just do something like this. And I'm thinking I want to add a little bit of detail here and sort of make like a little indentation here that goes all the way down to add a little bit of extra detail to this. So what I can do here, since this is something that has symmetry, so it has two symmetric sides, and I don't want to have to model both sides for this. So in this case, I'm going to turn symmetry on. So I'm going to have my object selected here, and I'm going to come up here where it says symmetry off and just turn symmetry on to object X. So if we look down here at a little widget, we see that we want to symmetry this along the X axis, or rather mirror this along the X axis. So I'm going to turn on object X for symmetry. And then as we select this, for example, so I'm going to sort of position this, get this positioned somewhat right here. And say I select a face here. Oops. Select a face here and do an extrude. It's going to extrude both sides. Now, in some cases, you may see that it turns black here. That's okay. You see that it kind of fixes itself. That's just an issue with the normals. And I will sort of explain what normals are at a later date. But this is something that, we can jump in and probably get a little bit more detail here if we jump into our front view. And then we can start sort of modeling this out a little bit. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between my different views quite a bit, as you should. It's very important to always look at things from all different angles. That's extremely important. I can't stress that enough. So that's what I'm going to do. So you'll see when I do the time lapse, you'll notice that I do jump around to different views So I'm going to extrude this down. We'll jump back to our front view, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this all the way to the corner of our shingles here. And then just sort of the same way we did our house here, or our roof slope, I'm going to just add in some edge loops with my multi-cut tool and just sort of move that in. Now I want to point out that you can smooth things. So if you hit 3 on your number on your keyboard, you'll go into like a smooth preview mode. We're not going to be smoothing anything here. So if you want something to look like a very smooth transition, then you need to do that with geometry in this case. We're going to do this all completely unsmoothed, just to make things a little bit easier on us. So the way I like to do this is just half it and then smooth it half, and that will if that makes sense, but that will give it sort of just like a really smooth transition overall. So for example, I did that middle one and then I half that, and I'm going to do the same thing once again. I'm going to half that kind of, and you can use your G key, which is your last used tool. So if I hit my G key, you'll see that I get my multi-cut tool again. So just using hotkeys definitely speeds up your workflow a little bit. And this one, I'm going to pull in right here a little bit closer to this edge, because what I want to do here, just to add a little bit of extra stylized detail, is add a little edge loop there. And then I'm going to grab this one and sort of just flare it out a little bit. Like that, just to give it a little bit extra style. So that's actually looking pretty good. I think I may want to take the whole thing and just widen it a little bit more, because I want to make sure it covers up the edges of all of those shingles. But I also want to make sure that none of my shingles are sort of poking out there's the smooth preview that you can see there, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do everything in what I would call hard-edged mode. So yeah, so something like that. If you do see them poking through here, that's fine. It's probably not going to be a huge issue. That's just, I believe that's just a display. As long as you don't see them poking through in your perspective view, you should be fine. So now I think what I'm going to do, just again to add a little bit of extra style and flair to this, I'm going to grab all of these front faces here. So I'm just holding down Shift and selecting all of these front faces. And I'm going to hit my extrude function. And I'm going to extrude them all in a little bit. It may not sort of deform properly. As you can see, it's not really deforming properly up here as I would like. So I'm just going to manually grab this edge right here and move it up. And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to kind of just fudge things to where you want them to be to make things look a little bit nicer. And then once again, I'm going to just go back to face mode, which will automatically reselect those faces that I had selected, which is good. And then I'm going to just extrude them in a little bit, just to give me sort of like a stylistic detail here. So something like that. I noticed that I think I kind of forgot to move this one in a little bit. So I want to fix that little curve. So I like how that's looking stylistically. I do see it shingle poking through there. So I could deal with this a couple different ways. I actually see them poking through there a little bit as well. So I think what I'm going to do here is just grab these faces. And I did that just by clicking one and then shift double clicking the other one in a line. And that will sort of select that face loop. And then I can just extrude this out a little bit. And then I'm going to thicken it just a tad more. So I have that nice little detail there. I'm going to grab, I noticed that there's sort of like two little bumps there, or two little horns kind of right there. So I'm actually going to make those here just by grabbing these. Once again, extruding them out like that. And then I'm going to jump into my front view here and just kind of shape them. Shape them a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. I do, as I mentioned earlier, I do want to bevel the edges. So I'm going to select all of my edges here, if I can, both sides. And again, I'm just double clicking to get those I'm basically just trying to get all of my 90-degree angled, or my sharp corners for the most part. I'm just trying to select all of those. So I'm just looking through to make sure that they're all the corners that I wanted selected are selected. I think they are. And then I'm just going to do a bevel. Like that. And then you can already kind of see it from back here. That little bevel is giving us a really nice edge highlight. And that's very important for just like the overall quality of how things are going to look, is we really like that edge highlight. And I'm going to do a little bevel on the inside here too. Just the tiniest of bevels. So we'll click bevel, maybe drop that one down a little bit just to get a tiny little fraction of the bevel. We can leave that inside portion without a bevel. I think that's fine. So that looks pretty nice. The other thing I want to do here is, and this is something that you should be sort of mindful of as you're working, is your normals. And now I haven't talked much about normals yet, but basically your normals are the way that an edge or a polygon is displayed. And I'll definitely explain more about what normals are in a future video. But say, for example, like we have these two edges here that are very sharp looking, and I want to make sure that those kind of look a little bit more rounded. I'm just going to select this edge, and you could just probably double click that to select it. And then I'm going to go up to Mesh Display, Soften Edge. And now we'll see that that looks a lot more round, and it doesn't have that sharp sharp edge on it like we had before. So now when we zoom out, that looks like a much smoother little detail than what we had before. So I'm liking that quite a bit. We can still do some adjustments here. Like I think that we could even smooth this out a little bit more in certain areas. But I think I'm kind of liking where it's at this point. And you know, the other way that we can kind of hide our shingles, I noticed that we have some shingles sort of poking out right there. I'm actually going to move this guy down a little bit, but we can move our shingles just manually. So I can grab this one shingle right here and just kind of move that out a little bit. And that will kind of move out of the way. Now, anytime we can add little sort of bits of detail in our model is great. So any sort of like little details that you want to add. So for example, I can come in here and say, make it where this side is a little bit different than this side, or we can add in little cracks or something like that. I think it's great. The more of those little tiny details you can add in to your model, the more sort of dynamic it's going to look, the higher quality it's going to look, the more attention you've put into it is going to be visible. So it's just going to look much cooler the more little details, fine little details you can work into your model. So what I'll do is I'm going to turn symmetry off, so I can sort of give this some asymmetry a little bit. So I can come in here now and say, select this corner. And maybe I want to bring these guys up a little bit. Kind of make this corner look like it's a little maybe part of it's like rotted off, or you know, I can take some of these and kind of bring them in, bring them out. The one thing I like to say is there's no straight lines in real life. So if you can just sort of make things a little bit asymmetrical, roughen things up a tad bit, even if it's a very new straight looking model or building. It's very rare that anything has perfectly straight lines in real life. And you know, unfortunately, that's one thing that 3D does very well, is makes everything look nice and organized and have straight lines. So we need to manually sort of go in and mess things up a little bit if that's the case. So I can come in here and say, maybe I want to put a little crack in this part of the model here. So I'll take my multi-cut tool. And then do something like this. And then what I can do is take that edge, go up to mesh display and harden edge, and then it'll give us a nice little sharp cut right there. And I can do the same thing for these two edges. So mesh display, harden edge. And now we have a nice little detail right there. And I can definitely add lots more of these throughout the model, right? So I can come in and just like take a little section here. I'm just going to take this edge, move that in, and then I can double click that edge and then go to mesh display, harden edge, right? And then I can take these two, mesh display, harden edge. And now that gives me another little crack right there. And what I think I'm going to do to get this to look a little bit more like a crack is take these two edges and go to mesh display and soften edge, so we don't see those so much. We just see that little line. So I'm kind of happy with that. I like how that looks. So the more little fine touches, details that you can add like that, it's just overall the cooler your model is going to look. And try to think about it in terms of how this house has worn over time, right? So like if there's an area of the house that gets used a lot or whatever, and it may have more cracks, or like where shingles, like we could even make a little patch right here if we want to kind of patch the roof, have an area where the roof is patched. So just try to think like that. We do have reference we can follow, but also try to, while you're modeling something, you always want it to have a story. So you can start to develop a story in your mind. You can make things that happen to this house in your mind. Maybe it's been through a few hurricanes or storms, or a few remodels or additions, and think about where those details are going to show up as you're modeling. And again, that will just pour much more life into your model as you're working on it, if you can kind of develop these little stories for it. So that's one way I'm going to add some details to my house. And I can just take this thing now and I can duplicate it. So Control D or Command D to duplicate. And then I'm going to freeze my transformations for it. So I'm going to do that by going to Modify, Freeze Transformations. And then in my Z axis, I'm going to do a -1 scale. And that will basically flip it in the other direction. And then I can just put that in position like that. And if I want, I can also flip it in the X direction. That way this little crack isn't the same on both sides. So I can do -1 there. And now I have a crack on this side, a crack on that side, and it's not going to be as noticeable, right? Because we don't see it here, we see it here. We'll see this little crack here and we'll see it over there, but they look completely different from those two different angles. So just another example here, I'm going to go and say, make my steps. So I'm going to, again, just create a cube. And I'm going to kind of just scale that into position. Something like this. Grab this face, pull it out a little bit. And then for my stairs, I'm just going to go in, and so there's 1, 2, 3, 4 stairs. So I'm going to make 4 little divisions here. So I want it to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So that we're going to have one right in the middle. So I'm going to eyeball that around 50%. And then we can go around 50% of that, around 50% of that. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. These human errors that we have in our models are just, again, they add to the realism and add to the story of the model you're working on. So then I'm going to just select those 3 divisions there and extrude out my first step. And then just extrude out my second step. Extrude out my 4th step, 3rd step, right? And then for these bevels, I'm just going to bevel these guys right here. I want to keep these as kind of a sharp angle, so I don't necessarily want to bevel these. And when that happens, we're going to create some n-gons. So I'll quickly show you how we can fix those n-gons. So if I just do a bevel, and again, just a very slight bevel, and you can also type in some numbers. So if I think 0.1 is still a little bit much, I can come in here and just say 0.05, right? And that will give me that little bevel. Now, what happened when we did that was it makes this face an n-gon. So this has more than 5 sides on it now. So we have 1, there's a side over here, 2, 3, 4, 5, more than 4 sides. So we need to make this to where it's not an n-gon anymore. So I'm just going to grab my multi-cut tool and I'm just going to make a little quick triangle right here. Oops. And again, I'm using my G key, which will repeat the last tool used and make things go much faster for me. So I'm going to do that to both sides. And now the n-gons aren't like crazy important to take care of for this project, since we're just modeling it or just rendering it unsmooth. We're not actually using any smoothing. So it's not super imperative that you get rid of every little n-gon, but I do want to instill the fact that it is important to not have any n-gons in your model. So you should learn to get rid of them as early as possible and learn to recognize that they're there. Otherwise they'll get away from you really quickly, and then they're just sort of hard to manage. So from here, I can add in a couple more edge loops here and just sort of mess these stairs up a little bit. So I'm just going to grab some of these and make it like these stairs are not all perfectly straight lines. So something like that. And now as we kind of zoom out, we can take a look at those. We can see that nice little edge highlight there that our bevel did. So those are looking great the way they are. Now, the other way that I'm going to be modeling things throughout the time lapse is probably just using this surface as a live surface and drawing right on top of it. And you can do that 2 ways. So to make this a live surface, all I need to do is click it and then come up here and click this little magnet right here. And you'll see that it'll make our main house a live surface. So we can't actually click on this house anymore. But what we can do is draw on it. So here I have a Create Polygon tool that's set to interactive on the grid. Now, by default, your polygon tool or your cube tool will not be set to be interactive. If you double click it, you can change the settings. I'm not sure if it's here. Collectively, it's probably going to be under Create, Polygon Primitives, and then here you turn on Interactive Creation. I made a little tool for it here in my toolbar, so I don't have to go in and click that. But what that will let me do now that I have that as a live surface is I can come in here and I can just draw cubes like right here on that surface. So you have to kind of make sure you get the angle right in a lot of cases. So you can do something like that. So that is a very useful way to do things. And I'm going to be using that quite a bit in the time lapse. Another thing that you can do here is use your, if you go to mesh tools, you'll see a create polygon tool. And what I can do with this is draw right on top of the surface. So I can draw something like that. Now, notice how I'm trying to have the same number of polygons across from each other. The reason I'm doing that is because when I hit enter here, that will be an n-gon. So I do want to come in with my multi-cut tool now and make it to where those are no longer n-gons. And then I can grab those faces and just extrude, do an extrude function, extrude it out, and then I have a surface there. So those are the methods that I will be using to model out a lot of the details for the house. And now that you know how I'm going to be using those, we'll do a time lapse of me just going through and putting in a lot of details into the house in a time lapse.